Muslim world is responsible for this, and they're attacking us because we're free and prosperous. That is just not true. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have been explicit. They have been explicit, and they wrote and said that we attacked America because you had bases on our Holy Land in Saudi Arabia. You do not give Palestinians a fair treatment, and you have been bombing. I didn't say that. I'm trying to get you to understand what the motive was behind the bombing. At the same time, we had been bombing and killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis for 10 years. Would you be annoyed? If you're not annoyed, then there's some problem.
That was Republican Congressmember Ron Paul of Texas speaking last night at the Republican presidential debate. Noam Chomsky, your response.
I think what he said is completely uncontroversial. You can read it in government documents, find it in polls. Maybe people don't like to hear it. Muslims, sometimes called moneyed Muslims. People in the Muslim world who are deeply embedded in the U.S. global project, lawyers, directors of multinational corporations, and so on, not the general population. And it was very much like what Eisenhower had was concerned about in the National Security Council in the 1950s. There was a lot of antagonism to U.S. Policy in the region. Partly support of dictators blocking democracy and development, just as the National Security Council concluded by then, 1958, 2001, there were much more specific things. A lot of anger about the U.S. backing for the way Israeli occupation of the occupied territories, settlements, the bitter oppression of the Palestinians. And also something that isn't discussed much here, but meant a lot there. These sanctions against Iraq. This is 2001, remember. The sanctions against Iraq were brutal and destructive. They killed hundreds of thousands of people, international diplomats who administered the oil food program resigned in protest because they regarded the sanctions as genocidal, carrying out a kind of a mass slaughter of Iraqis. They were strengthening Saddam Hussein. They were compelling the population to rely on him just for survival. These were major crimes of the 1990s. And privileged Muslims, moneyed Muslims in the Saudi Arabia, elsewhere, were bitterly opposed to this. Not because they hate our freedoms, because they don't like murderous and brutal policies.
But didn't Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Mike Mullen once admit that the biggest threat to our national security is our retired debt? Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel, is there a dollar-for-dollar correlation between the amount of military spending and the amount of military strength?
No. Unfortunately, that's not been true for a very long time. Look, I think we need to understand that Mr. Panetta is presiding over the Department of Defense, which has a lot in common with the Federal Reserve. You can't audit either of them. Nobody can tell you with precision where all the money goes, and we do know that lots of the money goes to friends. So no, the answer is we absolutely do not translate that money into military power. We've supported the Olympics. We've got all sorts of portions of the defense budget that have nothing to do with military power.
Why is it that members of Congress and the American public have this false view that we have to support management's favorite manufacturers because, God forbid, we should cut money to the military? It might let the bad guys attack.
Well, first of all, there's no existential military threat to the United States today. There's no one out there who, frankly, is interested in attacking us directly, that is, as a nation state. And the terrorist threat has always been much exaggerated, and it can be handled, quite frankly, by securing our borders and tightening up. Unfortunately, defense spending, to a large extent, is treated by members of the House and the Senate as a way to redistribute income. So you redistribute income to your constituents. That income goes through many of the large defense corporations and some of the small ones to preserve employment, to cultivate prosperity in places where it might not otherwise exist. But much of that spending, frankly, is not needed.
Answer me this, please. Why do we need to be in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Libya, in Yemen, in Uganda, and why do we need 900 permanent military installations around the world on which the sun never sets?
Well, the answer is
but we
since
don't.
1991, for the last 20 years, we've had a very tight consensus inside the Beltway on the left and the right, a cabal of neo-Wilsonian interventionists convinced that the world will only be safe when we rule most of it. And so they have supported what amounts to military hegemony by the United States everywhere. It's driving us bankrupt. We're broke. We can't afford it. We don't need it. And quite frankly, we would profit from getting out of most of these places for two reasons. First of all, the threats would actually recede because our very presence in many places is unwanted. And secondly, many of the nations that we've been protecting, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, all the way to Norway, Central Europe, Southern Europe, would have to invest the money to protect themselves. And by the way, they can afford it. We don't need to pay it for them.
Colonel Macgregor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.
I'll tell you why Congress can't. At the same time our military is facing deep spending cuts, our president is threatening another war, this one against Iran. Joining me now is retired U.S. Army Intelligence Colonel Anthony Schaefer, author of Operation Dark Heart. Colonel Schaefer, it's always a pleasure. Welcome here.
Always
Colonel,
good to be on, Judge.
Many people who are self-proclaimed hawks, who say that they are strongly in favor of the defense of the United States of America from enemies, real and imagined, have attacked Ron Paul as having an unrealistic or even a dangerous view about our foreign policy. You, a career military officer, have defended Ron Paul. Make the case.
Well, I have. Now, don't forget, Ron Paul and I debated on John Stossel's show back in May, and we have differences. But with that said, he has the most realistic policy regarding Iran, Judge, because of two things. First, the Iranians may already have the bomb, and this rhetoric from the other candidates, you know, Santorum and Romney, is not only uninformed, it's ill-advised. I think it's silly. Secondly, Jim DeMeth even said this. We cannot hope to continue to have an expeditionary military to the size we have based on the fact we just don't have the money. Therefore, you have to be very precise, very realistic in what threats are real. And I think Ron Paul's policy is the most accurate based on what we need to face as a nation going forward.
You spent a year in military intelligence, so you know of whom I'm about to speak. The head of the Israeli Mossad says Iran is not a threat to Israel, and if it is, we can deal with it on our own. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the same thing. Why do you think Ron Paul is the only Republican who agrees with them, and the other Republicans are disagreeing with them?
Well, that's a mystery to me, because the Israelis themselves have said, leave us alone, we'll deal with what we have to deal with as a country. Frankly, right now at this point in time, we need to allow the Israelis to do what they feel necessary to feel secure. I mean, it's their country, it's their issues. With that said, we have to take a realistic look at what we need to hold sacred regarding our own self-interest as a nation. The idea of involving ourselves in expensive wars, frankly, President Reagan tried to avoid getting us involved in large land conflicts, as I would show, regarding the bombing in Lebanon. He did not want to see us bogged down.
Is the United States government engaged in covert operations on the ground in Iran as we speak?
I got to be honest with you. I don't believe so. However, I do believe we're doing everything we can to understand what is going on inside. There are real threats there, Judge. Don't get me wrong. The Iranians are trying to develop a new class of nuclear weapons. I believe they already have at least 2 nuclear warheads available to them. They're looking at EMP weapons, which could devastate our infrastructure. But the question becomes, are they rational or irrational? I disagree with the State Department's comments a couple of weeks ago saying they're irrational. These folks are painfully irrational by the fact they understand the survival of the regime depends on them acting somewhat rationally to make sure we don't do anything to go after them.
Got it. Colonel Anthony Schaefer, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.
My friends, you don't have to, you don't need to do nation building in Israel. We're already built. You don't need to export democracy to Israel. We've already got it. And you don't need to send American troops to Israel. We defend ourselves.
Why does Israel need our help? We need to get out of their way. I mean, we interfere with them. We interfere with them when they deal with their borders, when they want to have peace treaties. We tell them what they can do because we buy their allegiance and they sacrifice their sovereignty to us. And Israel should take care of themselves. Israel has 200, 300 nuclear missiles, and they can take care of themselves. Why should we commit? We don't even have a treaty with Israel. So I think they're quite capable of taking care of themselves. I think we do detriment. Just think of all the money we gave to Egypt over 30 or 40 years. Now look, we were buying friendship. Now there's a civil war. They're less friendly to Israel. That whole thing is going to backfire once we go bankrupt and we remove our troops. So I think we should be very cautious in our willingness to go to war and send troops without a proper declaration by the U.S. Congress.
President Obama reportedly signing off on this. Sources say CIA operatives are on the ground in Libya and in contact with the opposition.
And joining us to talk more about the CIA's possible role in Libya from Washington, former CIA counterterrorism analyst Michael Scheuer. Michael, thanks for being with us this morning.
You're welcome.
So there are reports out, again, that the CIA is on the ground in Libya, contacting and vetting the rebels. Is this setting the stage to arm them?
I don't think there's any other possible reason for it, and the president clearly has sent the agency in to find out who he is supporting and to see what kind of material, human material, we would have to work with if we decided to, if the president decided to arm and train these people over the longer term.
Yeah, and you're concerned about this prospect. You think it could become another Taliban situation for the U.S. What, in your mind, is the worst-case scenario here?
Well, Libya has been very strong in sending young men or having its young men go overseas to fight in Islamic insurgencies in the Balkans, in Chechnya, Afghanistan, especially Iraq, when the height of the fighting was there. Those that don't get killed, of course, go home. And I think the core of the resistance, whatever little military ability they have, is probably made up by people elsewhere we would call mujahideen. And so it's a dicey proposition to be getting involved with this. I'm not sure that the opposition, if it takes power, is going to be much better than was Gaddafi.
But that's why you need to have the CIA, I presume, in there vetting, as we said, who are these people, who are the elements that are funding them or supporting them, who are the politically the most palatable and the least palatable among them. The White House saying that no decision has been made. I have a question for you as a CIA veteran, I guess. I mean, the fact that we even know about this, is that unusual? I mean, should we just assume that the CIA in this sort of a situation would, of course, be in there on the ground?
Well, you have to assume that the president wants the best information that he can get. And if he wants to have that information, he has to have somebody on the ground. And so, yes, I think you assume wherever there's trouble, you'll find the agency. The other point I would make here is that vetting the people who are in the opposition, of course, is only you're only able to do that to the extent that they're willing to talk to you. Are really, I think, probably not better than 50-50.
What's the alternative if we don't arm the rebels and they're clearly outmanned and outgunned by Gaddafi's forces? What's the better solution here?
The better solution was, as Mr. Paul said, never go at all. This was none of our business. But I think what we're seeing is the string is playing out. We threatened Gaddafi, and that didn't work. There's an arms embargo and an economic embargo. That didn't work. There was a UN resolution, and that didn't work. Aerial bombing has continued and has impact, but it hasn't defeated him. Now we're at the stage where we're going to try to apparently try to train and arm the resistance. That takes a long time. I don't know if we have that time against Gaddafi. What we're seeing is the president putting himself into a corner where his only option is ground troops.
But that's something that
you led the CIA's unit that tracked Osama bin Laden 1996 to 1999, and you believe that, much like that situation, America's involvement in Libya could prove to be a recruiting tool for extremists. Why?
Oh, it's absolutely a recruiting tool. It's the American-led West
attacking a Muslim country that has
oil.
oil.
They've been very careful to say it's not the American-led West, that NATO has now fully taken over the operations.
Well, that
yes, our firepower was used in the beginning, but that this is a coalition that includes Arab states.
That may fool some Americans. It's not going to fool the people who sympathize with bin Laden and other Islamists. This is really a U.S.-led operation. And you talk about the Arab states that are involved. The Arab states are tyrannies that are hated by their own people. This is a piece of theater set up by Mrs. Clinton and Mr. McCain and the bipartisan group that loves to intervene in the Muslim world. This is Americans killing Muslims again, and it looks like it's for oil.
I just want to ask, are you trying to have it both ways in saying that, okay, these are tyrannies that hate their own people? Well, that's why we're helping, because in Libya, it was the people that wanted Gaddafi out, that they were tired of it. So weren't we then supporting Islamic democracy, I guess you could say, in these countries where they're tired of totalitarian rule?
If we were supporting Islamic democracy, that would be one thing. But if you listen to Mrs. Clinton and especially the rather crazed Ms. Rice at the UN, this is all about democracy in a world where democracy is not going to take hold.
I think it's very clear, Michael Scheuer, that you are no fan of this policy and this administration. I think calling Ambassador Rice crazed is certainly a significant charge.
Well, I don't know. I've just listened to her. You know, that's only my impression. And I have to say, this is not a Democratic problem. This is a Republican problem, too. Both parties love to intervene in other people's business where there are no U.S. interests at stake and where we spend enormous amounts of money at a time when we're nearly bankrupt. That doesn't seem to me to be a wise practice of American statesmanship.
To call the United States bankrupt, the United States is running humongous deficits, yes, but the economy and this mission in Libya are two separate issues.
They're not separate issues, ma'am. You're just carrying the water for Mr. Obama.
I'm certainly not carrying anyone's water, and I will assure you of that. Michael Scheuer, thank you so much for your time. We've had a very long, exhaustive interview. You had plenty of time to give your point of view on that. We're going to be right back. It's 38 minutes past.
Thanks, Michael.
Benjamin Franklin once observed that those who would trade their liberties for security will wind up losing both. James Madison stated that no nation can preserve freedom in the midst of perpetual warfare. Few can question that America's founding fathers epitomized true conservatism. There is something seriously wrong in America today precisely because the elites from both political parties have forgotten about Franklin and Madison and ignored their wise counsel. Why is it that we call something, why is it that because we call something in a certain way is important? When we use the expression of terrorists, it is important because how you name and define something shapes how you think about it and how you respond to it. It frames the narrative. Instead of bumper sticker definitions, we should instead be asking whether international groups that use terror genuinely threaten either the United States or any vital national interests. If we were to undertake such an analysis, we would quickly learn that frequently the terrorist label is misleading. The exploitation of fear of terrorism by those in government has led to wars that did not have to be fought. Fear has been the key to the door for expansion of government and government powers, and the people in charge in Washington have seized on the opportunity. It has also eroded the liberties that have defined us as a nation. To cite only one example, the position taken by the Obama administration that it is all right to assassinate American citizens overseas based on secret information violates principles of due process and deprives every citizen of the constitutional right to defend himself before a jury of his peers. The government has also decided that it doesn't need any judicial review to read your emails, look at your bank account, and it can even attach a GPS device to your car so that it can have a record of where you go and who you visited. John Pistole, head of the Transportation Security Administration, says that his officers can force you to strip naked at the airport and there is nothing you can do about it. If you object and try to leave, you can be arrested, fined, and imprisoned. Government is currently twice as big and twice as expensive as it was in 2001. The federal deficit has grown nearly fivefold during that time. And this is all because America's leaders, who viewed the world in terms of institutions and power, looked at the terrorist tactic and drew all the wrong conclusions, namely that those we call terrorists hated the United States for no rational reason, and that there was a military solution that could be imposed to make the terrorists go away. The Washington elite confused America's ability to field a large army with something we call policy. In this case, foreign policy, not understanding that using the military is a failure of foreign policy, not an alternative to it. The same officials and politicians also created a vast and ineffective homeland security bureaucracy, the domestic equivalent of an interventionist foreign policy. This has stripped many Americans of their fundamental liberties here at home. Predictably, the international situation has become even more unstable as a result of the enormous expansion of the security state. When meddling in the affairs of others began to produce bad results, the solution was more meddling, most recently in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, never looking at the intervention itself as a possible source of the instability and the terrorism. Some of the numbers behind what has happened should appall every true conservative. The United States now spends nearly $1 trillion every year on the military, homeland security, and intelligence. Much of the money is borrowed from China. If one assumes that there is something like 500 active terrorists in the world who are actually ready, willing, and able to attack the American mainland, and there are likely less than that, it works out to something like $2 billion per terrorist per year. Fear of terrorism drives growth in government and has led to involvement in multiple little wars and some bigger ones as well. Subsequent exercises in nation building, all of which have been unconstitutional and none of which have turned out well, have also raised the bill. The so-called global war on terror, now referred to as overseas contingency operations, is without end and without limits and has made the U.S. hated and feared in most of the world, not respected. It has even made American citizens potential targets of their own government without any recourse to the protections afforded by the Constitution. And America's war against the world did not have to happen. There are real threats in the world against Americans and American interests, but military action in support of the national interest should only be a last option after every other step has been taken. Whenever I hear the expression American exceptionalism, I cringe, because for the Bachmans and Perrys, that means it's okay to drop bombs on people because we know that we're good folks and we suspect that the folks we're bombing are not. Exceptionalism is no excuse for acting irresponsibly. And then there is the issue of blowback. Why is America the target of terrorists and suicide bombers? Surely not because it has freedoms. As the dear departed Osama bin Laden once put it, and possibly the only known joke ever told by a terrorist, if freedoms were the issue, Al-Qaeda would have been attacking Sweden. Ron Paul, former CIA bin Laden task force head Michael Scheuer, and numerous others have noted that America has become a target because it is involved militarily in so many countries, meddling in other people's business. As they put it, they are over here because we are over there. Above all, the American people should watch the money. It is fashionable to blame the Republican Party for many of our ills, but the war party in the United States is truly bipartisan. It is driven both by the lust for power and the good old-fashioned profit motive. The current push to attack Iran has more Democrats behind it than Republicans, and it is fully supported by a media that has been characterized as being largely liberal, but which really shares the collectivist viewpoint and interests of the Washington elite. War is big business, and it produces money and jobs for a lot of people, ranging from think tanks to defense contractors to congressmen and senior government officials who are looking for a nice income supplement when they retire. The American people must demand a change in that dynamic. Into the early 50s, it was still possible for a traditional conservative Republican like Russell Kirk or Robert Taft to object to America's growing global role without being labeled as isolationist or being ostracized by one's own party. That changed as war became an engine driving the economy, with a bit of pork sweetening the deal in every congressional district. Today, one might argue that weapons are the only thing that the United States produces for which there is a worldwide demand. That is not only sad, it has been the undoing of the American Republic. In short, real conservatives who believe in small government, fiscal responsibility, a rational foreign policy based on national interest, and non-involvement in other people's quarrels should never support global wars on terror or global wars on anything. They should reject completely the insidious and absurd notion that Washington can intervene all over the world and not raise taxes to pay for the costs, handing our security over to the Chinese lenders and bankrupting our children and grandchildren. Some in Washington have already seen the folly of our present course and are speaking out. Quote, "The moral and constitutional obligation of our representatives in Washington are to protect our liberty, not coddle the world, precipitating no-win wars while bringing bankruptcy and economic turmoil to our people." Ron Paul said that in 2008, and it should be our rallying cry for 2012 to achieve a constitutionally based foreign and defense policy that truly benefits
the troops, because what the troops are telling you, both in Iraq and those who return, is that they don't want any part of this. They want to come home.
Ron Paul will restore America. He will restore the Constitution, and he will truly support the troops by bringing them home to defend this country.
Our campaign got more money from the troops than all the other candidates put together.